Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Victoria. I'm the co-founder and director of Fiquem Sabendo. And we'll start a series of interviews and articles about how governments put obstacles on access to information law globally. So our team received a grant from the International Center for Journalists, ICFJ. And we now want to provide a different experience for our readers. We want to make this interchange between American law, the American FOIA, and the Brazilian Lei. So Americans have a Freedom of Information Act, also known as FOIA, since 1966, right? Our access to information here is from 2012. So you have about half a century of FOIA and less than a decade of Lei. So there are a lot of differences between the Brazilian and the American law, but we also think there are a lot of similarities and places where we can help each other get better access to information. So we're very glad that our first interview is with one of the greatest experts of FOIA and someone I have the honor to call a friend. So welcome, Michael, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Michael is an experienced journalist that is the founder of MuckRock. And MuckRock is a nonprofit organization, collaborative news that brings together journalists, researchers, activists, and regular citizens to request, analyze, and share government documents, right? To make politics more transparent and democracies more informed. So for those of you who read Fiquem Sabendo oftenly, it seems like a very similar description. But of course, MuckRock is a lot farther away, and it's one of the most important benchmarks on access to information globally. So it's an honor to have you here. Let's start with the basics. Can you tell us a bit about yourself, how you got sucked into the FOIA universe and MuckRock's mission?
Yeah. So my background is a mix of sort of journalism and technology. I've always been really inspired by investigative reporting. I've had the honor of getting to work on some really large, impactful projects early in my career. And about a decade ago, I got really interested in sort of what could technology do to kind of help out investigative reporters, but also other organizations that were trying to kind of help the public stay informed. I think one of the things we were seeing was that fewer and fewer people were filing public records requests. There didn't seem to be a lot of sort of really modern approaches to this. And when you talk with younger journalists or people who are kind of starting out in the field, they kind of had a sense that public records was something that you needed really specialized knowledge for, or that was something that, you know, you had to have a lawyer to get anything done with. So we decided to sort of, what could we do to kind of modernize the practice, right? And back in 2010, when we started in the US, public records was very much mail-driven, fax machine-driven. You talk with a lot of young reporters, a lot of people who are interested in government transparency, they don't even know how to send out a letter, let alone sort of navigate complex bureaucracy. And so what we wanted to do was sort of simplify that process. What we wanted to do is kind of bring that into the digital age so that you can file a FOIA request with any agency in the US via your phone. And also put together sort of more public resources, right? Because I think one of the things that people really run into as a challenge is sort of even knowing what to request, what kind of information can they get, how to phrase that request, finding good models was really challenging. And so we built a platform that sort of wraps around the public records process in the US by, you know, we actually mail out requests on behalf of our users, but the user just sees a web form. And then we have this massive repository, about 80,000 public records requests that other people can learn from.
It's amazing. We love just surfing on MuckRock's website and learning what you guys are doing. Keeping up with that question, you know, how hard is it today for regular citizens to send FOIA requests in the US? And does it require previous training, previous knowledge, or is it already mainstream?
Yeah, I think it's still a bit of a skill set, but we've tried to sort of lower those barriers. And I think there's more interest today than in public records from the public than there's ever been, which is really exciting, right? I think you see FOIA mentioned in popular media. When it came to sort of police transparency, you had celebrities like Ariana Grande and Britney Spears kind of weigh in on recent legislation. And you see this in pop culture. You see people sort of say, I have the right to FOIA. And I think people are more broadly understand how important this stuff is. And I think people are also more skeptical of government in sort of saying, show me the evidence that what you're doing is what you say you're doing, or show me the evidence that you're working on my behalf. And so that's really exciting. And agencies are slowly improving their processes. So many agencies, you can just send an email to the agency and saying, hey, this is what I want. You don't need special magical language, but there are certain skills, right? You can't just go to an agency and ask a question. You have to ask for a document. And then knowing your rights if an agency denies a request is still a challenge. And so we've been really focused on sort of that next level of gig. We've helped broaden the field. What can we do now to kind of help people be more successful when they use those requests?
That's awesome. We are experiencing this buzz of regular people around FOIA as well. There have been some recent polemics around the Brazilian president and FOIA, and we were very glad to see that it became a trending topic on Twitter. The major news channels talked about it extensively. And so looking 3 years back, that would never have happened. So it's really good to see we're evolving, right?
Yeah.
But let's talk about the means to send the request. So around here, we can do everything online. And there's even one centralized system for all the federal branches. But that is obviously an advantage from being late on the Access to Information Act. But, I'm aware that you guys have some burdens of sending mail requests, and there's a lot of uh, fragmented branches. So can you tell us a bit about this hustle with the means to get requests?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, the Free Information Act in the US started in the 60s, and there were some improvements throughout the 70s, and there's been modernization attempts throughout that. But this process really was started in the era of paper, where fax machines are sort of like breaking cutting edge technology. And you can see that legacy in a lot of how FOIA works today. But also it goes also back to sort of how government operates. So many agencies in the United States have not had investments to sort of digitize and modernize their services. So much of this bureaucracy still runs on paper, right? So even if they had a digital FOIA portal on the back end, there's still people searching through filing cabinets and that sort of things, which has real costs. It has costs for government to go retrieve the data. It makes it harder to do searches. It makes it easier for things to get lost, misplaced. Hundreds of thousands of documents have been destroyed in fires and floods, for example. And that's not when the agency is necessarily trying to hide something, but it means that a whole lot of requestable records are destroyed. And so what we've seen is that sort of this legacy of bureaucracy where they don't modernize, they don't digitize their records. Still today, lots and lots of paper records are being created. Lots of things that are just 5, 6, 7 years old, they have to go through, search through filing cabinets. And that slows down the process, increases costs, and really makes it hard for the public to understand what government is up to. But then on the front end, you still have agencies say, hey, please mail this request in. Or if you want an appeal rejection, you have to mail something in. And that creates a real barrier, right? I think a lot of older government bureaucrats sort of see, well, a letter isn't that big a deal. But for somebody who has never sent a letter, that is, that's a major barrier to access rights. I think there are challenges and potential dangers with everybody using one centralized platform. That means that if you've got somebody bad in charge of it, it makes the experience worse across the board. But I also think there's challenges when you have a more distributed FOIA process like we do in the United States.
So I believe another huge difference between America and Brazil access to information is gratuity. Here in Brazil, every citizen has the right to request any information free of any cost whatsoever. do you believe that charging for the process, or even, to get mail, to get the request mailed in, you need to put some pennies in. So do you think that differs American people from sending the requests?
Absolutely, yeah. I think the vast majority of requests in the United States are free. I think it's something like 3 or 4% of requests we have to pay for. But I think in those cases where people are charged, it really has an effect of sort of discouraging people from even requesting records in the first place, right? And there's been cases where we've seen basic contracts cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to get. And so I think that's really discouraging. I also think there's another sort of negative output that then agencies have an incentive not to improve the record keeping, right? Like if the agency has to pay that cost out of their own pocket, then they have an incentive to improve their document search and retrieval and continue to improve the process. If the requester takes that fee, then agencies are actually incentivized to have worse file keeping, because then it just makes it harder for the public to have access to those records because they just pass along the cost. And I think that's a real problem, is that agencies have been kind of stuck in the past and sort of figuring out, okay, searchable email has been a real challenge. For many federal agencies, up until a few years ago, if they wanted to keep an email for more than a few weeks, they would literally print it out and put it in a filing cabinet. That's crazy, right? But because those costs were put on the requester, that was how they incentivized things. So I think those fees can be very discouraging for requesters in the short term. Even a small fee, we've seen local agencies start to say, oh, we're going to require $20, $25 for every request you file. And that, if you're just a citizen or a resident who's kind of interested in some information and you have the right to that information, being told you have to pay $25 just to access it, just to even ask the question, is really discouraging for folks, and sort of silences people who don't have financial means for getting access.
And also, well, I don't, here well, journalists are sending thousands of requests. We in our team are sending daily 5-10 requests. So if you charge $25 for each of those requests, right, you usually have to get more than one request to get to the bottom of a story. So it kind of adds up, right?
Yeah, and I think agencies like to talk about the cost of fulfilling requests, but I would argue, and I think you see a lot of evidence that having more transparency means that bad contracts are canceled quicker, that fraud is discovered more quickly, and that it discourages people from trying to commit that fraud in the first place. If you know your actions are going to be secret, you feel like you can get away with a lot of things. But you look at how much money public records requests have saved taxpayers because we found out fraudulent or ineffective programs. And, especially with, you talk about military gear or surveillance equipment, these contracts are costing millions and millions of dollars, more than, FOIA programs cost to run. And so I think there's a really strong argument that strong FOIA programs, even if they do cost money, end up saving that agency money pretty quickly, just helping rout out fraud and abuse.
I think there's also a conceptual problem there, right? Because if we understand that everything that the government produces and storages is, on the ultimate level, our data and public documents, then it makes no sense for us to pay for our own documents and data, right? It's the only reason why we have to file in requests is because the government doesn't have the structure to put all the information public. But ultimately, it should be all public and actively public, right?
Yeah, and I would love to see government agencies move more towards that approach of just, you don't want requests, publish it in the first place, and design systems so that it segregates sort of private information. There's some data that should not be released, but just go ahead and proactively release everything else. And that way you build trust with the public and you don't have to deal with public records requests.
Yeah. Well, another question on the same range is it possible to request information anonymously? And if so, is that important? And do you think identifying yourself as a journalist does good or bad?
Yeah, so I think it's really important concept in the U.S. Free Information Act that it shouldn't matter who is requesting the data when it comes to deciding how it gets released or what gets released, right? So that if a famous journalist goes to the government, or a military contractor goes to the government, or just an ordinary resident, or even somebody in a different country, the principle is that if this is releasable to one person, anybody else can go in and ask for that same information. I think that basic standard of fairness is really important. And so in a lot of cases, anonymous requesters are okay. It does vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But then there's another angle in terms of people who are making an argument, and this comes back to the fee issue, is our fee system says that commercial requesters, if you're requesting this information for your business, you have to pay a fair amount of money. If you're requesting just because you're interested in it, you pay less money. If you're requesting that information because you're a journalist or doing it for research, you pay very little money. And so in those cases, people do have to justify, okay, this is why I'm requesting this, and this is why it's part of this public interest work. And so those questions are tied up in fee issues. And if you eliminated fees, then you'd eliminate needing to know why somebody's requesting something.
For sure. You said there are different jurisdictions. How does it work around there? Because here we have like the national law, and then you might have you have some regulations around states, but the major concepts have to be countrywide.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the federal law governs sort of federal agencies. So there's one law that covers all federal agencies, but each state and some of the territories have their own public records laws, right? And then Washington, D.C. has its own public records law that kind of falls under FOIA. So you've got about 53, 54 different laws that govern depending on which agency you're requesting information from. Now, the state and local laws are typically based largely on top of the federal law, but there's a lot of differences between some states will release police disciplinary records, for example. Other states won't. Certain places have very quick timelines for turnaround, other places don't. And so, you know, sometimes that works out well because you can get some data in some states that you can't in others, but other times it can be really a patchwork in terms of sort of what's released and why.
Yeah, so that would be the next question. It's a huge challenge for us in Brazil to request information on state and local branches. They're not on the unified system. They don't have still the culture running. They don't have the process to open the data. So even, you know, we did some two nationwide, but based on state data research. And what we learned is that, you know, there's absolutely no pattern on the data being even gathered. You know, some states don't know how many females are being killed. They only count by number of killings. They don't differentiate on sex. So there's no way to make a national database based on the state's data. And as we know, there are a lot of really important issues that are done in the state level, like policing. So how do you guys deal with cities and states on FOIA?
Yeah, so we've designed our system so that it works with any law in the United States. And so we went in and we coded every law, which is a lot. But then I think it is really important to kind of acknowledge, right? Like it's very hard to do sort of apples to apples comparisons, right? Where if you get state data from two different states, you need to be very careful about understanding how that data is generated and what comparisons you can make and what you can't, right? So in some states, they might say, oh, we have 0 of this kind of form, and that might be because there was 0 of those cases, or it might be because nobody bothered to fill out those forms, or they might have a different type of form. And it gets to be really challenging. So I think some of this is you highlight those differences, you highlight the importance of why these records are kept, and call out agencies that don't release certain types of information. So a few years ago, we were really interested in sort of how military gear was going from America's wars in the Middle East, and then coming to local police departments. That's been a very big issue in the U.S., right?
Seems very current.
Well, yeah, very current. It's people are now looking at that data with a lot of renewed interest. But what we found was that maybe 40 states released that data when we requested it, and 10 states said this was a secret, right? And so then you kind of say, all these other states released this information. This is why this information is important. And eventually we did get the full data set for all 50 states, but that took sort of making those arguments and highlighting the value of that data. And so I think it's, the laws are important, but also organizations like your own and sort of other organizations that are pushing for transparency, we really do need to tell the public this stuff really matters, and this is why it matters, and this is how it can be used. It's not enough to just sort of defend the principles of transparency. We really need to do a good job of explaining the concrete changes that transparency can lead to.
Awesome. Well, sometimes or many times a story takes hundreds of requests. So is it common for American journalists to join forces in a story, and how collaborative journalism is essential to access information?
That's a great question. I think that's becoming a lot more common, right? I think a lot of newsrooms still feel very competitive, but I think pressures and sort of budget cuts have made journalists more open to sort of collaborating across newsroom lines, particularly if it's local newsrooms that are in different areas where they're not competing directly with each other. You see a lot more of those collaborations now, as well as collaborations where organizations will, you know, maybe one is a group that's focused on education, and maybe another is focused on criminal justice reform, right? And so they're competing against very different things. And so they're much more likely to sort of share and be willing to kind of collaborate on those things. So we're seeing a lot more of those, and they bring expertise. The resulting stories are better than if either newsroom had approached it on their own. And you're able to kind of help everybody do better work at a more efficient way than previously. So we just launched a new project with a nonprofit group as well as some other newsrooms just yesterday, in fact, where we're filing 500 requests around New York State. That would be a lot for any one newsroom to do on their own, but splitting that work up, we can have a big impact.
That's awesome. What about crowdsourcing, which I understand MuckRock is pretty great at? Can you tell us a bit a successful story?
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot of different ways that we've been trying to figure out. I think readers care a lot about this stuff, but B, getting people involved and getting people to sort of feel like they're actively contributing and sharing their questions and sharing their ideas. That can be really challenging for a newsroom, but it helps build deep relationships with your readers. I think right now people are very skeptical of the news media. I think people don't like politicians, they don't like reporters. And so I think figuring out ways to kind of help people feel invested and let them know that newsrooms are listening to them is really important. And crowdsourcing is one way to do that. And so we do a variety of projects looking at sort of like, suggest the request get filed with this agency, or suggest we file a request in your hometown. And so that's a way for people to help direct our coverage, and sort of they share their tips. They say, hey, I've seen some weird stuff going on with this local prison. Can you file a request there? And so it's easy for us to kind of take that, help them turn that into a public records request, which they might struggle to do on their own or not know how to do on their own. And then we share the results both with them and with the wider public. And then as we start to get back results, figuring out new ways of kind of helping lots of people contribute to kind of going through those documents. So that's something we've been doing a lot lately. And it's worked really, really well.
Awesome. We've tried sometimes, but it feels like we need some more of that culture of crowdsourcing around here in Brazil. It's not as mainstream as it is in America right now. Well, in your experience, which is very extensive, what are the most common reasons to deny access to information in your country?
I think over the last decade, we've seen national security. So people say, you know, this is, we need to protect the country, or this is international secret or security secret. Security comes up again and again, and some really wild things. In a lot of cases, we know that this wasn't actually about protecting national security. This was about, you know, making sure that officials don't get embarrassed, right? Right now, one of our frequent collaborators is suing the federal government because the president said that a male dog, is a boy dog was kind of part of this mission, but then previously the military had said it was a female dog. And so there's no national security implications in the dog's gender, but this is a case where it looks like the Department of Defense kind of lied to the public about something trivial to save face for the president, right? And that's, I think the dog's gender really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but the Department of Defense kind of going and publicly lying about something to protect the president's from embarrassment. It's very bizarre that they're claiming that's a national security issue, and that's exactly what they are claiming. So I think we're, we see national security a lot, but then also just delays. And I think the federal government has gotten a little bit better about this, but if you have to wait 5, 6, 7 years for documents, that's not really useful for a reporting context, right? It's the government always complains about leaks and leakers, but if the only way to get something in a timely manner is to have a source provided to you, so that's not an outright denial, but access to records, if you have to wait a long time, is can be just as damaging as sort of claiming some exemption.
Well, tell me a bit about this timeline, because here the major complaint we get when we do workshops for journalists especially is, oh, it takes too long to come, the answers and everything. And here in Brazil, we have a 20 days plus 10 days. So in like the limit is 30 days for you to get back with an answer. And we see a lot of tweets about, FOIA journalists getting documents from years ago. How does that work? You don't have a set timeline? What happens?
So we do have a set timeline. It's actually the same. It's 20 days plus a 10-day extension. But what courts have found over the years is that agencies don't put enough funding and resources into their FOIA programs. And so they just don't have the resources to fulfill those with their current spending. Now, I think what the court should have done is order agencies to properly invest in their FOIA programs, but instead the court said, they can't meet these statutory deadlines, so we'll let them extend those deadlines out, in some cases, years. And so even though on paper we do have very similar deadlines, in practice, agencies don't put enough resources into their FOIA programs. As they're getting more and more requests, they have fewer and fewer staff to handle those requests. And so the deadlines just keep getting worse and worse. And so a lot of agencies have very large backlogs. Not every agency, but a lot of agencies, they say, you know what, we're going to miss this deadline and this is going to take us a long time. And that's how it's going to be. So one thing a lot of agencies have started doing is sort of breaking up their requests into different queues. So if you ask for just a few pages, they try to get you a pretty quick response. If you're asking for thousands of pages, that can take a lot longer, which, I think that's reasonable in some circumstances, but I don't think anybody should be waiting years and years for documents. I think that shows that their document search process, their document storage process is really broken, and that's something that they need to fix.
Yeah. Well, I remember this story about how the FBI had a very old process on how to get information together. And that was later pointed as one of the big issues with 9/11, right? So I guess we'll have to wait for something like that to happen for some change, because it doesn't seem like it's coming.
Yeah, I think these agencies, they've hired bad contractors. The FBI did spend, I think, over $1 billion to kind of digitize all of its search processes, not for FOIA, but for just in general. But still, it's so much. You get these FBI files, and they're still typewritten, or they're printed, or paper, And I think it's 2020. Things should be digital, and you'd think that these agencies that are massive, well-funded agencies could afford, something that even small businesses and nonprofit organizations could do in terms of moving to electronic records.
Awesome. Well. You guys have about 50 years of advance in access to information. So you probably have precedents for most of the requests you do. Do you use precedents for to get a successful answer? How do you search for them? And well,
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. So there has been a lot of litigation in FOIA at the federal level. A lot of times it's a lot less at the local and state level. But I think being able to kind of cite that legislation and say, hey, or cite that litigation and say, hey, according to this lawsuit, this information was previously released. Now, the average requester is not supposed to have to know that sort of thing, but we have been working on ways of kind of making that data more accessible, right? And so we've built a database of sort of commonly used exemptions from federal agencies and sample language that people can borrow from to kind of appeal those rejections. We partnered with the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press on something called FOIA.wiki, which is kind of like a Wikipedia, but for FOIA exemptions. That's a really amazing resource as well. But I think we're always trying to figure out what can we do to kind of connect lawyers. There's a lot of lawyers who are doing really great work in this, but a lot of times only other lawyers see that work. And so we're always thinking about what can we do to kind of help make it easier for organizations to kind of share their documents or make it easier for people to search for precedent. And so I'm really excited. A few years ago, we merged with Document Cloud. And so we're really interested in sort of figuring out how can we make it easier to kind of search and share that kind of data so that you don't need a law degree to kind of go in and successfully get some information.
it feels like MuckRock had to fill in all the gaps that the government left, right? You guys created the technology to make the process smooth and all this training. So it's great that we have you, but it's sad that we depend on small small organizations like ours compared to the whole federal governments of our countries, right?
Yeah.
We always hear about American journalists suing for FOIA, and that is absolutely not a common thing here in Brazil. We probably have, like 10 episodes of that, and those would be like huge newspapers that have the resources to go after that. It feels like it's a bit more mainstream in the US. How does that work? Do you guys sue for FOIA, and is that successful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say that, the vast majority of requests people don't sue for, right? So I think we've helped publish millions of pages of documents, and we've only filed very, very few lawsuits. So most of the time you can just file a request, go through the administrative processes, and that works. But sometimes you need to kind of go to court to kind of get them to actually comply with the law. And that's a really important element as well. So one of the things in the US law is that if you successfully sue and the agency didn't follow the law and you can prove that, then the agency has to pay your legal fees. And that's really important for two reasons. It makes it easier for a newsroom to find a lawyer who will sue pro bono, and sort of the newsroom doesn't have to pay anything up front to kind of litigate, which suing can get very expensive. And then B, that encourages agencies to think twice when they deny a request. If you know you're going to have to not just release the records, but pay for your attorney and their attorney if you mishandle a request, that creates a strong incentive to kind of get it right, and sort of it puts more potential power in the requester's hand. That's not true at the local level everywhere. And so some states, they do have attorney's fees. Get paid by the agency. Other places they don't. Sometimes it depends on sort of how the judge is feeling that day. But I think one of the things that we found is most important in terms of whether there's a good functioning public records program is, can somebody sue and get attorney's fees awarded?
Mm-hmm. That's probably a huge incentive. Well, we're going to finish and let you go, change the access to information landscape in the US. Can you just leave a message for people who are just starting to work with public records right now?
Yeah, I think once you kind of start getting into public records, you see how many different areas it can touch on and how important it is to not just journalists, but to activists, to researchers, historians, and to ordinary people who there's lives are sort of impacted directly in this in ways that they don't even know. And I think one of the things I really love about public records is it feels like such a strong democratic right. I think the government is oftentimes telling us what we can and can't do. You have to pay taxes, you can't do this. But now public records really reminds us that we're in charge. As you said earlier, this is the people requesting the people's documents, right? And I think that's such a really wonderful democratic principle that, you know, it's always inspiring to me when people get into the field and kind of understand that the government works for you. And this is you getting a chance to kind of check over that work and remind them that actually it's the people who are in charge. And that, something to me, there's something really, really special about that. And I think you don't need to be a lawyer. You don't need to be an experienced journalist. This is something that you can just put in a letter to the government and get answers to the questions you have. And that applies for everybody. And that's really, really cool.
Yeah, I totally agree. I usually say, I'm not sure it's going to sound well translated, but when, you know, FOIA is a way of bringing back the protagonism in a democracy to the people. So it's a way of, you know, it actually makes us feel powerful, right? It's quite a distinct feeling where you say, no, that those are my rights and you have to comply with that. And it's such a rare feeling. It's quite cool, right?
I think that's a great way of putting it. And I think that power, this is, in a democracy, the people are in charge, and it doesn't feel that way a lot of times. And FOIA gives you agency in a way that is too rare these days. And so that's really exciting.
Right. Thank you again for all your time. It's always a pleasure talking to you. And please feel free to talk to, you know, contact us, and Fiquem Sabendo will have its doors always open.
Likewise, looking forward to finding new ways to collaborate going forward.